He was not born to be the king who would hold Britain together. He was not the brilliant golden heir. He was not the prince everyone watched. And yet, when the old world began to crack, George V would become exactly the kind of monarch the country needed. Not dazzling, not romantic, not larger than life. Steady, disciplined, hard to shake. George Frederick Ernest Albert was born on June 3, 1865, at Marlborough House in London, the second son of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and Princess Alexandra. In other words, he was born close to the throne, but not at the center of it. That place belonged to his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, and in a royal family, that difference meant everything. George was not raised as the boy who would one day wear the crown. He was raised as the spare. Important, yes. Royal, certainly. But not the one history seemed to be waiting for. And maybe that is where his story truly begins. Because George V grew up in the shadow of expectation that belonged to someone else. He was born into one of the most famous royal families in Europe. His grandmother was Queen Victoria. His father was the future Edward VII. His mother, Alexandra of Denmark, brought beauty, glamour, and powerful family connections of her own. Around him was rank, ceremony, tradition, and the full weight of monarchy. But George himself did not begin as the obvious star of that world. He began as the second son, the boy expected to serve, not rule. And sometimes, those are the lives history changes most brutally. He was not born to be the king who would hold Britain together. He was not the brilliant golden heir. He was not the prince everyone watched. And yet, when the old world began to crack, George V would become exactly the kind of monarch the country needed. In January 1892, Prince Albert Victor died during an influenza pandemic, only weeks after becoming engaged to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck. Overnight, the line of expectation shifted. George was no longer simply the second son. He was now the next in line after his father, and the life that had once seemed mapped out for someone else began to close around him. That kind of change was not just constitutional, it was deeply personal. George lost his brother, and at the same time lost the distance that had separated him from the crown. In May 1892, he was created Duke of York. A year later, on May 3, 1893, he became engaged to Mary of Teck, the same woman who had been engaged to Albert Victor, and they married on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. It was a union born in unusual circumstances, but it would become one of the most important partnerships in modern royal history. And this is where George's story begins to change shape. Until then, he had been the prince shaped for service. Now he had to become something more. Not yet king, not even yet Prince of Wales, but no longer peripheral, no longer sheltered by his brother's place ahead of him. The monarchy had started to move him toward the center, and George, with all his reserve, discipline, and stubborn sense of duty, was about to be tested by a role he had never originally been born to fill. In 1901, Queen Victoria died, and George's father became King Edward VII. That change pulled George even closer to the future he had never been born expecting. He was now heir to the throne, and later that year he was created Prince of Wales. The shift was formal, public, and impossible to ignore. The second son, who had once stood just outside the brightest circle of royal expectation, was now being prepared for the highest role in the kingdom. But even then, George did not suddenly become a glittering figure of romance or effortless grandeur. He remained what he had long been shaping into: serious, dutiful, reserved, and deeply conscious of obligation. That was the kind of prince he had become, and in time, it would matter more than anyone yet understood. Beside him stood Mary, and that mattered too, because George's rise was not only about titles and inheritance, it was about partnership. Mary of Teck was not simply a royal wife in the background. She was disciplined, intelligent, and deeply aware of the institution she had married into. Together, they began to look less like a decorative royal couple and more like something sturdier, more dependable, the kind of figures a monarchy could lean on. And as the years moved forward, that image became stronger. They built a family. They carried out royal duties across Britain and the Empire. They represented continuity. But beneath that surface, Europe itself was changing. This was still the age of kings and emperors. Royal houses seemed permanent. Thrones still looked ancient, secure, almost immovable. But that sense of permanence was already beginning to crack. Social tensions were rising. Political demands were growing. The old confidence of monarchy was no longer beyond question. George had been born into a world where crowns seemed untouchable. He was growing into manhood in a world that was slowly becoming more restless, more modern, and more dangerous. And that is what makes this chapter so important. George was no longer just the prince who had unexpectedly moved closer to the throne. He was becoming the man who would inherit not simply a crown, but a system under pressure. A monarchy that still looked powerful, but would soon be tested in ways Britain had not seen before. Beside him stood Mary, and that mattered more than it may have seemed at the time. Together, George and Mary began to project something important. Not glamour, but stability. Not brilliance, but endurance. By the final years of Edward VII's reign, George was no longer simply the younger son pulled forward by tragedy. He had become the man standing closest to the future of the British crown. Serious, careful, dutiful. Not the most dazzling royal in Europe, but perhaps something far more useful. Because when his moment finally came, Britain would not need a dreamer. It would need a man who could stand firm while the world around him changed. In May 1910, Edward VII died. And this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. And with that, George's long preparation ended. He became King George V. After a life spent being shaped for duty rather than spectacle, he now stood at the center of the institution he had once seemed destined to orbit from a distance. He was 44 years old, no longer the spare, no longer the son standing behind someone else's future. Now the crown was his. But he did not inherit a calm kingdom. He inherited strain. Britain was entering a period of political tension, constitutional conflict, and social change. One of the first great tests of his reign came almost immediately, with the crisis over the people's budget and the struggle between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. George V had barely taken the throne before he was drawn into one of the most important constitutional confrontations of the age. It was not the kind of drama won on battlefields. It was quieter than that. But it mattered enormously because it forced the monarchy to operate with care, restraint, and political balance. This is where George's character began to matter in a new way. He was not a ruler of grand gestures. He was cautious, methodical, deeply conscious of constitutional limits. And in a monarchy that could no longer simply impose itself by force of tradition, those qualities were becoming essential. The king had to represent continuity without overstepping, authority without recklessness, stability without spectacle. George V, almost by temperament, was built for that balance. In 1911, he and Queen Mary were crowned at Westminster Abbey. It was a moment of ceremony and majesty, the kind of royal image the world still expected from Britain. But even here, history was shifting beneath the surface. That same year, the Parliament Act sharply limited the veto power of the House of Lords, changing the constitutional landscape of the kingdom. The crown still glittered, the ritual still impressed. But the old order was adjusting, and George V was now king in a Britain where monarchy had to survive by adaptation as much as by tradition. And beyond Britain, the wider world still looked like a grand web of royal houses. Europe was full of crowned relatives, ancient dynasties, imperial confidence. For a moment, it could still seem as if monarchy remained the natural language of power. But that world was already moving toward catastrophe. George V had finally reached the throne, and almost at once, the age he inherited began to slip away. Then came 1914, and with it, the war that would change everything. What had looked like a continent of secure thrones and interwoven royal families suddenly became a continent of fear, mass death, and political collapse. George V was not watching this from a safe historical distance. He was inside it. The war reached into every part of British life and into the monarchy itself. It was not only armies that were being tested, it was loyalty, identity, legitimacy. And for a king whose own dynasty carried a German name, that danger was deeply personal. The British royal house was still officially Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. In peacetime, that had seemed manageable. In wartime, it became a liability. Anti-German feeling rose sharply across Britain. German titles, German connections, German blood ties, all of it now looked dangerous, and George could not ignore that. He had been born into a Europe where royal families were bound together by marriage and blood. But the war was tearing those bonds apart. The old dynastic world was no longer a protection. In some ways, it had become a threat. This was one of the most revealing moments of his reign, because George V understood something crucial. If the monarchy was going to survive, it could not look distant, foreign, or out of touch with the people suffering through war. It had to look British, solidly, unmistakably British. And so in 1917, he made one of the most important symbolic decisions of his reign. The royal house abandoned the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and became the House of Windsor. It was more than a name change. It was an act of political survival. A recognition that monarchy in the modern age could not rely on old assumptions. It had to adapt, or it would fall. And across Europe, other crowns were already falling. The Romanovs in Russia would not survive. The German Empire would collapse. The Habsburgs would lose their throne. The old royal order that had once seemed permanent was breaking apart before the world's eyes. That is what makes George V's story so striking. He was not the most glamorous king in Europe, not the most brilliant, not the most charismatic. But while other dynasties were being swept away, he held his ground. Quietly, carefully, without drama. He did not save the British monarchy through spectacle. He helped save it by understanding what time he was living in. And yet even this war was not only political for him. It was personal too. Europe's ruling families were bound by blood, and George himself was closely related to rulers on other thrones. The collapse of those monarchies was not some distant abstraction. It was family, dynasty, and an entire old world breaking apart. That gave his position a strange tension. He was a king trying to preserve his own institution while watching the wider royal world, the world he had been born into, begin to die. By the time the war ended, Britain had endured unimaginable loss, and George V had changed with it. He was no longer simply the dutiful king who had inherited a crown in a changing age. He had become something more important, a symbol of continuity in a time of rupture, a monarch who had survived the greatest shock the old European order had yet faced. But peace would not bring simplicity. Because the war had not only wounded Europe, it had changed what people expected from power itself. The Britain George V faced after the war was not the same country he had ruled before it. Too much had changed. Too much had been lost. The old confidence of the pre-war world was gone, and monarchy could no longer survive on distance, ritual, and inherited awe alone. It had to feel closer, more human, more clearly tied to the life of the nation. And George understood that. He was never a theatrical king, but he did understand the value of presence, of steadiness, of being seen not as a figure floating above the country, but as part of it. That mattered in the years after 1918. Britain was dealing with grief on a massive scale, with political tension, labor unrest, economic strain, and a society that was changing faster than the old monarchy had ever been designed to handle. The empire still existed, but the world underneath it was shifting. Ireland became one of the clearest signs of that change. The crisis there had deep roots, and it could not be solved by royal symbolism alone. But George V played an important role in encouraging a more conciliatory tone at a critical moment, especially in 1921, when his speech at the opening of the Parliament of Northern Ireland called for forgiveness and reconciliation. It was not the language of conquest. It was the language of restraint, and that, again, was his strength. By now, the pattern of his reign was unmistakable. George V was not great in the old heroic sense. He was not a warrior king, not a conquering figure, not a monarch of dramatic personal myth. He was something that proved, in the modern age, to be more useful than that. He was disciplined, predictable, serious, a man who understood that monarchy had to live within constitutional limits and survive by earning trust, quietly, consistently, without demanding too much of the public imagination at once. That is one reason he was able to guide the crown through further instability in the 1920s and 1930s. Governments rose and fell. Political expectations changed. The monarchy had to deal with the growth of mass democracy, the rise of labor, and a public that no longer automatically treated social hierarchy as sacred. George did not stop history from moving. He could not. What he did was keep the monarchy from breaking while history moved. He made it look durable in an age that was constantly testing whether it still deserved to exist. And that is why so many people later saw him as underrated. Because his achievement does not look dramatic at first glance. He did not dazzle Europe. He outlasted it. He did not make monarchy seem glamorous. He made it seem dependable. He was the kind of king people can overlook precisely because he prevented collapse rather than starring in it. But that is often what survival looks like in history. Not brilliance, not spectacle, endurance. Then came the years that proved what kind of king George V really was. Not because they were easy, but because they were not. Britain in the 1920s and 1930s was a country under strain. Political power was changing. The old deference that had once protected monarchy was weakening. Economic hardship cut deep, especially during the Depression. And yet George V remained what he had always been, steady, restrained, and visibly committed to duty. He did not try to dominate politics. He did not try to become larger than the Constitution allowed. Instead, he did something quieter, and in the long run more important. He made the monarchy look stable in an unstable age. That was not a small achievement. In 1931, during the crisis that led to the national government, George V played a role in encouraging political cooperation at a moment of serious national anxiety. He was not governing in the partisan sense, but he was helping hold the system together. That is the pattern of his reign again and again. Not theatrical rescue, constitutional steadiness. He understood that the crown's power in the modern world depended less on command than on trust. By 1932, he also embraced a new way of reaching the public. His Christmas broadcast, begun the previous year, turned the monarchy into something more immediate and intimate for millions of listeners across Britain and the Empire. George V, a man not naturally associated with emotional display, became a voice people heard in their homes. That mattered. It helped reshape the image of the monarchy for a modern mass audience. Not distant, not unreachable, but present. And by the time of his Silver Jubilee in 1935, the public response made something clear. George V may never have seemed glamorous in the way some monarchs did, but he had earned respect and affection. Britannica notes that the Silver Jubilee allowed the public to express its admiration for him, and that says a great deal. He had not dazzled the nation. He had steadied it. In an age that had destroyed empires and shaken dynasties, that was no small thing. His health was failing by then, and on January 20th, 1936, George V died at Sandringham. He left the throne first to Edward VIII, and then, after the abdication crisis later that same year, to George VI. And that is part of why his legacy matters so much. The monarchy that George VI and later Elizabeth II would embody did not emerge from nowhere. It rested in part on foundations George V had helped strengthen: duty over display, service over glamour, continuity over drama. He was not the king people were most likely to romanticize. He was the king who helped make the modern British monarchy survivable. And that is why he matters more than many people realize. And perhaps that is the final irony of George V's story. He was never the most dazzling figure in his family. He was not born as the obvious future of the crown. He did not seem destined to become one of the defining monarchs of the modern age. But when Britain needed a king who could endure pressure, absorb change, and keep the monarchy standing while the world around it transformed, George V was the man who happened to be there. And more importantly, he was the man who was equal to that moment. He had been shaped by discipline, by service, by the long habit of putting duty before personality. In another age, that might have made him seem unremarkable. In his age, it made him essential. Because the early 20th century did not reward monarchs who relied only on grandeur. It tested whether they could adapt, whether they could remain constitutional without becoming irrelevant, whether they could still embody the nation while so much else was changing. George V passed that test. He did not preserve the monarchy by making it larger than life. He preserved it by making it durable, by making it seem solid, familiar, and dependable at a time when those qualities mattered more than brilliance. And that may be why he is so often underrated. His success does not come wrapped in legend. It comes wrapped in survival. So when people remember George V, they should remember more than the photographs, the beard, the resemblance to the fallen rulers of Europe, or the image of a stern, old-fashioned king. They should remember the scale of the age he lived through. the empire at its height, the war that shattered Europe, the collapse of dynasties, the pressure of democracy, economic crisis, and social change. And through all of it, George V remained what he had always been: steady, dutiful, and difficult to move. He was not the king no one noticed. He was the king many underestimated. And in the end, that may be exactly why his story matters. Because when the old world began to fall apart, it was not a dazzling monarch who held Britain's crown in place. It was George V. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.